By the time I was 5, she had made me a purple chiffon full-length dress. I could feel that discomfort that you can feel when people are around you, and they looked at me different. They started to treat me different.
Welcome to Pure Passion. My name is Jonathan Daugherty. I'm your host for today's show. It should never be underestimated how formative the formative years are. Seeds that are planted early in childhood can take root in ways we don't understand until much later in life. These deep-seated roots often manifest inner turmoil that can rule your life. That's the story of today's guest, Walter Heyer. Starting at age 4, Walter had seeds planted that would continue to confuse him throughout his life. Get ready to hear an amazing testimony of God's grace and the power of salvation.
When it all started for me, I was about 4 years old. And my grandmother was, for whatever reason, enjoyed cross-dressing me. And by the time I was 5, she had made me a purple chiffon full-length dress. And so when Grandpa was gone and my parents dropped me off at her house to be babysat, usually a couple of times a month, that was the routine. Grandma would dress me up as a little girl, and she just would get excited about me being a little girl. She liked me better as a little girl. She really reinforced that female appearance of mine, and with that seed planted in me, and I must say I didn't know that something was actually wrong, because I had no basis to look at the other side of it. I just knew that, when I was home, that didn't happen. My parents weren't like that, but my grandma told me to keep it a secret. As a little child of 4 or 5 years old, you don't know that a secret means there's something probably not quite right. And it went on for a couple of years, probably 2.5 years, and then I became so accustomed to cross-dressing and being appreciated and fawned over because she kept telling me how good I looked. I never got that when I was a boy from her. It was only when I was a girl. So, I'm sure that I enjoyed getting the affirmation. And so after 2 years, I decided to take the dress home. But I put it in a sack, and because it was a secret, I didn't tell Grandma I was taking the dress, and I didn't tell my parents that I was bringing a dress home, but I brought it home and hid it in the bottom of my dresser drawer. And knowing that when I had the opportunity and the house was clear, then I could put that dress on and maybe get those same feelings back that Grandma would make me feeling good about who I was. And there was nothing going wrong in the home. I couldn't see anything, or there was nothing driving it. It's just that the seed had gotten planted and was watered by my grandmother about my identity, and that began this two-sided view of who I was, because when I was at home, I was just a ruffian little boy with tore-up blue jeans and scuffed-up tennis shoes, and I was a rough little kid playing in the dirt. But still inside here, I had that image. I heard those words. I wanted that same kind of affirmation and feeling from when I was a boy, from everybody, like I was getting from Grandma when I was a little girl, but I wasn't getting that. So I guess then I began that time period where I took the dress home so I could at least feel the feelings myself that I would get when I put them on. Even though I didn't have Grandma speaking to me, I could hear her voice, I think, speaking to me. So it was very powerful. And it's very transformative in terms of how you begin to see who you are, but it's also very confusing. So it was funny because I had that dress hidden in the bottom of my dresser drawer. We were having dinner one night, table was clear, Mom came out, sat across from my dad, was sitting across from my brother, was down the road. And Mom says, "So what's with the dress that you have in the drawer?" And boy, I started breaking out in a sweat. And I said, "Well, Grandma made it for me." Well, you could have set off an atom bomb at that point, And so then this big explanation about what had happened. And then my dad, you could almost see him begin to glow like a Roman candle, because he was a part-time police officer, an industrial goods salesman, not exactly a wimpy guy. He was a judo expert and all that stuff. So he was, to say the least, not too excited about what he just heard. So then I began to tell them how long this had gone on. Well, then it blew up. And so from that point on, I wasn't allowed to go to Grandma's unless both my mom and my dad were with me, and my brother. We always went as a unit. So that going over there to be babysat by her ended. And of course, then Grandma felt she was very angry with me because I outed what was supposed to be a secret. And so that secret got out, and then I felt responsible for everything going wrong between my parents, my grandmother, and me. So now you see the dynamic. This is where I felt things were not going right, because I could see their reaction to me having this purple dress. Well, the purple dress disappeared, and I never saw it again. But here's the thing that was most interesting, is that purple dress sort of took on a life of its own as an image within my thinking. So at night, you know, when I was laying in bed, all these things went through my head. What Grandma had been doing, Grandma's voice, I could hear her talking to me about it. The explosion with my mom and dad, and the difficulty it caused between them, and the difficulty it was causing between my mom and her mom, and my dad and Grandma. So it was a very wild dynamic that a kid at this time, might have been 7 years old, didn't quite understand. From that point on, then I was sent over to my other grandmother, my dad's mother's house. And they were a very proper, wealthier family, and very, I would say, more uppity. My mom's parents were kind of Texas dirt poor people. And so this was a whole different dynamic. But people began to hear stories. The other grandmothers, my uncle and so forth, heard about me in that purple chiffon dress. And so then unfortunately, I became kind of the whispering thing. And I could feel that discomfort that you can feel when people are around you. And they looked at me different. They started to treat me different. And so when you have that dynamic going on, you actually probably take on acting out being different. And so with me, I started eating. I became, I was a skinny kid before this, and then I just blossomed. I was, at one time, ate 7 sandwiches. And, you know, it was like I was trying to fill that pain that I was feeling from everything that happened. But then my dad's adopted brother, who was only a teenager, one time at a family thing, decided that I was fair game, and he began to take me off behind the garage, and he began to molest me. So this started another thing that had happened, and so now I've got Grandma, the purple dress, and I've got Uncle who decided he would molest me. So that became his pattern. Now Grandma's out of the picture. Now I got Uncle Fred. And so I began to push away as much as I could from Fred, but he was like 16 or 17 years old at the time. He came over one day and asked my mom if we could go for a ride. I'd never been in a car with him. And he took me up in the hills and began to try to do some things that I knew were not appropriate. And I left the car and ran down the hill, ran all the way home. When I got home, I told my mother about what Fred was doing when he took me up the hill, because she had given him permission to take me in the car and take me for a ride. And she said, "Oh, that didn't happen. You're lying," she said. This really did happen. And the thing with Grandma really happened, and the thing with Fred really happened. So now my dad decided that it was probably better for him to try to shape me a little bit better. So the discipline got much more aggressive, and He would spank me with a hardwood floor plank. He became much more stern. But I think, as I look back on it, I think he didn't know what to do with me. This was way too confusing. I mean, this is, if you can remember, this is in 1944, 1945, 1947. So we're talking about the mid-40s. So there wasn't any context for, quote, what we know today about transgenders. So he had nothing to work with. I had nothing to work with except what was happening. And so he began to discipline me quite heavily. And some of it today, if we were to analyze that, would be called abuse because it left welts. And I got to the point to where some of the discipline was so painful. At first, I would just weep and cry in pain and fall on the floor and scream and all that stuff. But after a while, I decided the only way to defend against what he was doing was to be silent. And I took on a persona where no matter how hard he hit me, no matter what he did, I didn't flinch, I didn't move. He probably could have hit me with a sledgehammer and it wouldn't have bothered me. And that was the way that I internalized what was going on. Because now for me as a young kid, this is becoming overwhelming because I had no way to know what to do with all this information and what was happening to me. And I had no way to know actually what was, the term psychology or happening to my mind and my thoughts were not anything I was aware of. It was just happening. And that's just kind of who I was. But I began to excel in everything I did then. I wanted to outdo everybody. I wanted to run faster. I wanted to hit harder. I wanted to do everything much more aggressive than everybody. It was my way probably of dealing with the deep pain that I was feeling. By the time I was in my teens and going to school, I got into theater arts in school, and I became quite good at theater arts. I was in some plays. I won some contests for speaking Hamlet soliloquies and things of that nature that were very interesting to me. But I was also very successful at running track and eventually was good as a kicker on the football team. So I had this very split persona, but most of it was up here in my head. The female inside me was silent in terms of visibility, but lived mightily in my head. The little boy had grown up to be, working very hard on track and running track and winning medals and stuff in track. I had this going for me, but I had also really big struggles in school as far as academia. I had this stuff going on in my head all the time, and I wasn't good at school. It wasn't that I wasn't bright. It was that I couldn't concentrate. There was just too much stuff in my head. Everything was confusing. I mean, I actually began to have all these thoughts about who am I? Am I really a girl? Am I a boy? Why was Fred abusing me? Why was Dad hitting me? Why did Grant, these thoughts just they were like, I called it the radio in my head that played this stuff over and over again, and I couldn't turn it off. There was no off switch. My grandfather, my dad's dad, was a pastor at one time. Our relationship with church was my mom and dad took my brother and I to church and dropped us off at church, and they went home until church was over, picked us up and brought us home. That was church. I didn't have a relationship with God. I had never gone that far with it. And so later on, we moved and went to another church, and I was baptized, but I was still so terribly confused by who I was and so terribly damaged by the events that had happened to me. I couldn't get in a relationship with anybody, let alone get in a relationship with God. I was not a good reader. I had dyslexia. I had concentration problems. I was a bit of a mess. But the confusion was that of my identity, of who I was. And how would I then tell people about what I was struggling with? that also came into play about how I did in school, my grades, my ability to concentrate. I wanted to be able to talk to somebody, but I also knew that with what I was dealing with, trying to talk to somebody about something that I couldn't even explain myself would be very, very problematic. I didn't know what they were going to ask me. I didn't know really what to tell them. I didn't really want to come out against my uncle because by this time, he was a Marine, a drill instructor in the Marine Corps. He was a really tough guy. My dad was still a police officer. I was going up against, the men's men. And so I knew the things I was struggling with would not be received very well because of my experience with my dad wanting to try to shape me, I believed, by heavy discipline. All these things got in the way, whether it was at church. I attended church. Our family was church going by this time. By the time we moved, my parents started going to church. But I wasn't connecting with that. I mean, I went, I prayed for the Lord to take this stuff away from me, to heal me from it. I kept praying every year about that, take it away. But what I didn't understand was that I needed someone I could talk to help talk through this, that it wasn't just going to evaporate on its own. It wasn't just going to be taken away by some magical puff of smoke. During this time, I thought, well, this is something that must be so new to God, he didn't even understand it. That this is so out of, it came along and so this is something that he doesn't understand, so he didn't know what to do with it. So he's just there. But for me, I don't know what to do with you. It's kind of like what he was saying to me is what I felt. So I with that, felt like I was on my own, that I needed to fix this myself. As I grew later in life, I joined a car club. I was into cars. I had some race cars. As I got out of school, I went to work in an automotive shop so I could continue to work on my car. Eventually, I went to a city college and got a certificate for drafting so I could go to work in the aerospace industry and work on the drafting board because that was a neat job and it paid good, and that was a big thing. I did that, and I, over a period of time, was so good at my studies, so good at what I did. That's one of the things that was remarkable. Even though I was not good with a book, which I wasn't, if you gave me something to do and taught me how to do it, I could do it very well, oftentimes better than anybody that had ever read the book. So over a period of years, I became an associate design engineer on the Apollo space missions and worked on cryogenic connectors. So I knew that the marbles were floating, but if you would have given me a book and said, study this and study cryogenics, I never would have been able to do it. I couldn't have read the book. Everything I did was hands-on and relational, because I was very relational. But early on, as I began to work on the Apollo space missions, I was still going to church, and I met a girl one night at the Sunday night singles group. We began to date, and within 2 years, we got married. We were doing well. We had a nice little relationship. We had a great marriage. We were going to church. I was, again, still trying to see what God could do in healing what I had. And I talked to her about the struggle I was having. And as a family, we were living in Southern California and started going to Forest Home Christian Conference Center regularly. We'd go for couples conferences and family conference. And every time we went someplace, it was really connected to the conference center and trying to connect with my relationship with Christ. I was trying to build that. But I was also still struggling. The struggles just wouldn't seem to go away. That seed that Grandma planted continued to grow, and it continued to live in my head as if it was real, as if it was alive and well on its own, even though it wasn't out here. As I began to deal with this, there were times when I would then go out cross-dressed just to relieve the stress. It was my stress reliever. Well, that wasn't enough. So then I began to use alcohol to help relieve the stress. At all the time, I'm married now with 2 kids. I'm going out. Nobody's knowing this. I'd find a place far away from home to do this because I had the funds and ability to do that. And eventually, I left the aerospace industry and took a job in the automotive industry. And that gave me a great deal more latitude because they would send me far away from home. So that gave me, and I had an expense account. So I was free pretty much to stay in hotels, cross-dress, go out, still do my work. I became one of the most successful people in the company that I was working for and got promoted. By this time, I was still struggling, still cross-dressing, still married. The shame of what I was doing was too much to talk to anybody about. So where I started this as a child and not talking, lived through it. That secret that my grandma gave me, I kept that secret as far as what was going on. I knew how to keep a secret. I'm sure that seeing that explosion, that when my parents saw what happens when you let a secret out, I wasn't going to let the secret out. I wasn't going to tell anybody. So it really repressed the idea of letting it out. I continued to drink more when I was out. I continued to struggle with alcoholism. And yet, at the same time, I was moving up more and more in the ladder of success with the corporation. And by the time my kids were growing up, we're still attending church. I mean, if you looked at one side of my life, it would look absolutely perfect. White picket fence, 2 cars in the garage, everything's good. I'm making good money. The kids are healthy. Everything's good. I didn't drink around the house. I wasn't a slosh drunk at home. I did all that stuff when I was away, and I'd get that relief out of the way and then come home and be a different person. So I had this total 2 worlds that I lived in, actually 3 when you think about it, because I had the family life, I had the purple dress life, and then I had a great career that I was developing and becoming very successful at. There came a time, by the time I was 39 years old, and I started hearing about transgenders, and Christine Jorgensen was kind of the first one in the mid-50s that kind of triggered it, but I didn't look much into it. And so by the time I'm in 1981, it had been going on for 39 years. Well, actually, would have been at that time in me, I would have been struggling for about 36 years from the time my grandmother first cross-dressed me. That's a long time to keep a secret, to struggle, and to try to deal with it on your own without any psychiatric or psychological help. So I went to a specialist, the #1 guy in the world because I had the money to do it. And it was a guy who wrote the original international Harry Benjamin standards of care. He was the guy. He was the guru, knew how to diagnose the disorder. He knew what appropriate treatments to take, and he knew who should be doing the surgery if there was to be surgery and the hormone therapy. He knew it. He was the guy in San Francisco on Union Street. So I went into him and sat with him. In 45 minutes, he looked at me and he says, you've got gender dysphoria. And what you need to do is undergo gender reassignment surgery, take hormones, and just completely change and become a female. And I was kind of dumbfounded. And so I listened to it, and I said, well, can I come back and we talk more about this? So the second week I went back and I told him about my childhood. I gave him some of the information about what had happened in my childhood more in depth, about the abuse by the uncle. And he says, oh, and by the way, he says, I have your letter of approval here. You can take to the doctor and have your surgery, 2 sessions. And I said, well, that seems a bit quick to make that kind of assessment. So while he was prepared for me, he said, no, you're a candidate, perfect candidate for this. I've been doing this for years. I know what I'm talking about. And I said, okay, that's fine. Keep the letter. Let me think on it. And I waited 2 years. And during that 2 years, the pressure cooker, maybe from hearing it, maybe from grandma, maybe from the radio playing in my head, maybe from the sexual abuse, I can't begin to tell you what it all was, but there was a big mix master going on with thrown in with a little alcohol that by the time I was 42 years old, I had sat down with my wife and said, here's what's been happening. we need to divorce and I need to change genders. Well, there was the second bomb. When mom and dad's explosion, this was another one. And this was even more devastating because the kids were involved, and that kind of pain no one should ever have to experience. It's overwhelming.
There is so much important information in his story that we are carrying Walter's interview into a second episode. So join us next week to hear the rest of the story from former transsexual Walter Heyer. I'm Jonathan Daugherty for Pure Passion.